Hello, welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wyanberg. This time we begin our reading of Summer at Fairacre by Miss Reed. Chapter 1. The First Day of Spring. "What the Hanover do you make of this, Miss Reed?" Mr. Willett took the cap from his head and shook the snow from it, spattering the schoolroom floor with dark spots. 21st of March, he went on, first day of spring, and I reckon there's a good inch of snow all over. "Well, it can't last," I replied. "It's melting already in the playground." A clashing of pails from the lobby told of the presence of Mrs. Pringle, our school cleaner. Both she and Bob Willett, the caretaker, come soon after 8 each morning to see that Fairacre School is in good trim to start the day. "And how's Madam Sunshine doing today?" asked Mr. Willett, nodding toward the source of the noise. He was prudent enough, I noticed, to lower his voice. "As village schoolmistress, Mrs. Pringle is one of the crosses I have to bear. Mrs. Pringle enjoys the gloomier side of life, and is never so happy as when she is discussing distressing ailments, other people's peccadillos, impending disasters, or a really slap-up funeral, preferably with inner knowledge of how much money was left by the deceased and to whom it is going. Square, sturdy, and 60-ish, Mrs. Pringle is as tough as an old boot, but she has a bad leg, which dominates our lives at Fairacre. If Mrs. Pringle decides that she is overworked, and this happens quite often, the afflicted limb is liable to rapid deterioration and gives its owner a pronounced limp. One can always tell from the severity of Mrs. Pringle's hobbling what sort of mood the lady is in. There is no love lost between Mr. Willett and our cleaner, and I have to be very circumspect in dealing with both. This is not always an easy task, as both parties can be oversensitive to the reaction of the other. I have to tread as warily as Agag, and then, more often than not, I find that one of them has taken umbrage. Usually, of course, it is Mrs. Pringle, who is always on the lookout for the odd insult. One need only comment in a perfunctory way about the amount of grime children can collect on their hands, and Mrs. Pringle begins to bridle and to point out with unnecessary acrimony that there is always a plentiful supply of soap put out on the lobby. Moreover, that very soap has been put there with her own 2 overworked hands, and the basins have been cleaned so thoroughly, again by those same hands, that it would be possible to eat your dinner from them should you feel so disposed. When I first came to Fairacre as the village schoolmistress, I used to try to stem this flow of umbrage-taking by making ineffectual apologies and explanations. I know better now. It is far more satisfactory to let Mrs. Pringle have her head and to allow the torrent to flow over one. She thoroughly enjoys it, and I have now become so hardened that it makes very little impression. Over the years we have shaken down together pretty well, and the occasional clash of wills does neither of us any serious harm. On this particular morning we all 3 had cause for dismay. A particularly cold winter was being followed by an equally unpleasant early spring. The tortoise stoves were still needed to warm the school, and the children continued to wear their winter clothing. My own tweed skirts and thick cardigans had been in use for months now, and we all longed for sunshine, flowers, and lighter clothing. "When I was a boy," said Mr. Willett, "I reckoned to go bird's nesting this time of year. And there was primroses and violets in the hedge bottoms. My old dad's rhubarb was sprouting real steady. Look at it these days. We don't get no spring worth spitting on, and nothing don't start stirring till May. There was some chap on the telly t'other night said the seasons are just the same as ever was. He don't know the half." "I agree," I assured him. "And this other bloke, he says as the earth's axle, or some such word, is tilted off true a bit, so the weather's changed. I reckon that's more like it." He pulled an old-fashioned red and white spotted handkerchief from his corduroy pocket and blew his nose with impressive trumpeting. "Never got rid of me Christmas cold, neither," he informed me, stuffing the handkerchief away. Ah, I near forgot. Could you do with a morsel of winter Savoy? Good thing to have a bit of fresh greens this winter. That frozen stuff's all very well for second best, but you can't beat the real thing. I'd love some, I said. At that moment, the door burst open, and Joseph Coggs and 4 more boys rushed in, bearing a furious cat. "It's a stray, miss," they chorused. "It was under Mr. Roberts' hedge, miss. It's starving, miss." The cat was struggling frenziedly in Joseph's tight clasp. It was certainly cross, but did not appear emaciated to my eye. Mr. Willett scrutinized it closely. "That's one of Mr. Roberts' farm cats," he pronounced. "I know it very well. It's like its ma with one white leg. You take it back, boy, or you'll be in trouble." 5 pairs of eyes turned anxiously in my direction. "You'd better do as Mr. Willett says," I told them. "At playtime you can go back to the place where you found him, and if he's still there you can take down some bread and milk." Mollified by this compromise, the deputation and its victim departed. Mr. Willett looked at me and shook his head. "You're too soft with them by half," he told me. "In my day, Mr. Hope would have given him a clip round the ear for trying on a trick like that." "Teachers are not allowed to strike children these days," I said. "More's the pity," replied Mr. Willett, making for the door. His way was barred by the formidable bulk of Mrs. Pringle, who was advancing with an outstretched hand. Upon it were balanced a few fragments of a small paintbrush. "What's all this here, may I ask?" she boomed. Mr. Willett and I surveyed her wet palm and the debris. "Don't need much eyesight to see it's been a paintbrush in its time," replied Mr. Willett with withering sarcasm. "Then what's it doing down the plug hole of the wash basin?" demanded Mrs. Pringle, fixing me with a stern glance. "Someone's been trying to hide evidence," I said. "Put it on my desk and I'll sort it out." Mrs. Pringle deposited her burden and a number of soapy drops dangerously near the register and turned to face me, arms akimbo. "What them children need," she announced, "is a bit of old-fashioned discipline." "I've been telling her that," said Mr. Willett. And the two departed in rare unity as I went to ring the bell. By playtime, almost all the snow had vanished. There was still some whiteness under the school hedge, and the tiles on the north-facing roof were edged with shallow snow. The children were disappointed. It only needs a flurry of snowflakes to set them agog with anticipation, making snowmen complete with pipe hat and pebbles for eyes, tobogganing down the hill near Beach Green, scoring off old enemies with a well-thrown snowball. All these delights seemed within reach, but usually melt away as swiftly as the snow itself. Joseph Coggs and his rescue party prompted my memory and were allowed to dash down the lane to see if the cat was still languishing under the hedge. As expected, they returned somewhat crestfallen. "Mr. Roberts was up the yard," Patrick said, "and we told him about that poor old stray, and he says it wasn't no stray, but one of his'n." "His," I corrected automatically. "That's right, miss, his'n. So we just come back." "Came back. Like I said," agreed Patrick. I let the matter rest. Village schoolmistresses, and no doubt those who teach in town schools too, recognize the utter futility of trying to correct certain phrases. Fairacre's intractable examples include, "Miss, the nib of my pencil's been and broke." "Miss, could you threedle my needle?" And of course, "I never done it." As for the correct usage of the verbs to lend and to borrow, I despair of ever getting this particular piece of grammar across. "Can I have a lend of your duster, miss?" This is the usual phrase. Sometimes it is a borrow of. If I had as many 5-pound notes as the number of times I have carefully rephrased these requests, I should have retired from teaching long ago with a comfortable income. Now that the affair of the cat was settled, a lesson on fractions was undertaken until the dinner van arrived. Sliced cold lamb, beetroot, and coleslaw, followed by bottled plums and pink blancmange, is not my idea of a cheering lunch on a bleak March day, but the children tackled it with their usual gusto and rushed out to play afterwards with their spirits as boisterous as the wind which buffeted them down from the downs above. That evening, sitting by a log fire as though it were December instead of the first day of spring, I had a surprise visit from my old friend Amy. We were at college together many years ago. She is now married to a businessman who seems to earn a great deal of money. This busy life involves much traveling, and Amy is often left alone while he is away either here or abroad. James is a charmer and devoted to the opposite sex. Personally, I am sure that he adores Amy, but whether he is wholly faithful to her, I have my doubts. Although Amy is far too loyal to voice her suspicions, she is pretty shrewd, and I think she knows quite well that some of these so-called business trips include other interests. "A fire, how marvelous," she said, holding out her beautifully manicured hands to the blaze. "Nothing like the first day of spring for making one appreciate a log fire." "Coffee or sherry?" "What sort of sherry? You aren't still offering that stuff you won at the last raffle." When you have known Amy as long as I have, you do not take umbrage at this sort of remark. "That was jolly nice sherry, good and fruity. The vicar and I finished it off last week. Coffee, I think, after all." "Instant," I said, "and you're lucky to get that." Amy chuckled and fished in her elegant Italian handbag for a cigarette. She followed me into the kitchen. "I often wonder you don't get matching kitchen units," she said, surveying my equipment. "No money to pay for them," I told her, spooning out the coffee. "Top of the milk or hot milk?" "Top, please." "Good. It saves messing up a saucepan. No point in making work." "If you organized this kitchen, you could cut down the work. For one thing, all your working tops would be the same height." "But I don't want them all the same height," I protested. "If I'm mincing, I use the table. If I'm washing lettuce, I need the sink, which is deeper. The draining board's just the right height for chopping cabbage." Very well, you needn't go on. Obviously, you've become quite accustomed to these primitive surroundings and don't intend to change now." "That's right," I said amicably. "Would you like a ginger nut?" "I should love one. I haven't had a ginger nut for years, but I warn you I'll have to dunk it. I've got a filling that's cracked across." I think we've both got to the stage where it's permissible to dunk ginger nuts. Won't be long before we're mumbling our gruel with our gums. "Speak for yourself," said Amy. We settled ourselves by the fire. "I brought the Caxley Festival program with me. I thought we might go on to a few events." "What's on offer?" "A concert in the parish church. Modern music mainly, lots of bar talk." "Count me out, Amy dear. Those pews nearly crippled me at the carol service, and at least we stood up now and again. Besides, I can't take bar talk." "The trouble with you," said Amy severely, "is that you close your mind to progress. Well, what about this exhibition of modern sculpture?" "Where's that?" "It's all hefty outdoor stuff, I gather. They've roped off part of the common." "It sounds nice and peaceful, but what happens if it rains?" As the Duke of Norfolk said with admirable brevity when asked the same question about the coronation, "We get wet." "Carry on." "Your Henry Maughan appears to be giving a couple of lectures on British birds." "He's not my Henry Maughan, I'm thankful to say, but I expect I've heard those lectures several times on our village hall." 18th century silver in the museum, demonstration of hand weaving, 3 mid-European plays about the rise of the peasant classes. "The silver sounds agreeable," I said cautiously. "You do live dangerously, don't you?" said Amy. "Tell you what, I'll leave the program here and you can look it through and let me know. Frankly, I'm game for anything. James will be away for most of that time." "Where is he going?" "Holland first, I believe. Something to do with diamond merchants. Not that James will see much of the diamonds, but the money gets put into other things." "The Dutch are very clever at trading, I believe." "So I gather. Didn't they once own the East Indies? All those spices and jewels?" "My knowledge is pretty hazy. I only know they were jolly good sailors and had the cheek to sail up the Thames, or perhaps it was the Medway, and had to be chased off by someone who had a broom on the mast." "I don't believe it. Why on the mast, anyway?" "Amy, I really know nothing about the Dutch except that Holland gets flooded very easily, and the housewives are exceptionally clean. I should ask James about them when he gets back. After all, he will have first-hand knowledge." "Not of the housewives, I hope," said Amy with unusual tartness. She stubbed out her cigarette viciously. "If that's the time, I'd better be off. James makes an early start for Edinburgh tomorrow." "He certainly keeps busy," I said, accompanying her to the door. Too busy at times, replied Amy, getting into her glossy car. I've told him not to be surprised if I take a leaf out of his book and have a break myself one day. It was said lightly, but there was an underlying grimness which disconcerted me. She blew me a kiss and drove off, and I returned to the fireside with food for thought. The chilly weather continued for the rest of March. A few hardy primroses had braved the elements in the garden, and knotted bluebell flowers crouched in their glossy leaves, obviously unwilling to do more until the weather grew warmer. The leaves were still tightly furled on the trees. The winter silhouettes of the beeches and limes still showed up starkly black against the gray sky. At night, I was glad of my comforting fire and still put a hot water bottle in my bed halfway through the evening. The frosts were severe, and it would be many weary weeks before the geranium cuttings on my windowsill could be put out in the garden. I remembered Mr. Willett's words about the marches of old, and I knew that he was right. Somehow, nowadays, we seem to get no real spring, none of those balmy, tender days when one could walk in the woods admiring the rosettes of primroses, noting the glutinous stalk of a trampled bluebell, with the whole vista lit by a spangle of young leaves. Children coughed and sniffed as they had done all the winter, yet would still attempt to go out into the bleak playground without their coats until bullied into them by their elders. Winter ills were rife in the village at large, and the March meeting of the Women's Institute was a hearty collection of souls, was still canceled as the village hall stove had gone on strike, and no one could brave the Arctic conditions there with the windows glazed inside and out with thin ice. One frosty evening, when I was settled by the fire, marking essays and getting rather tired of correcting brids for birds and grills for girls, someone rang the front doorbell. As I crossed the little hall, I remembered all the warnings about opening doors to strangers, particularly if one was alone in the house. I'm always advising people to go upstairs and find out who the caller is from an upstairs window, but naturally I never do this myself, as I don't remember such things until the door is wide open. Luckily, tonight's visitor was only Henry Maughan with some draw tickets to sell, and he seemed glad to come in. I shouldn't really, he said, wiping his perfectly clean shoes vigorously on the mat, but to tell the truth, it's a good deal colder than I bargained for when I set out, and I shan't call anywhere else. I nobly stumped up 50 pence for a book of tickets to support some wild bird project dear to Henry's ornithological heart, and offered him a drink, which he refused. He stretched his legs out to the blaze and looked settled for the evening. I stacked the exercise books away and fetched a block of mint sweet. Well, indulge yourself with this, I said, breaking it with some difficulty. It says it is applied to successful polar expeditions. I suppose the unsuccessful ones were foolish enough to forget to pack the stuff. Ah, my favorite sweet, said he, taking the largest fragment. Where do you get it? Mr. Lamb at the post office keeps it. I never knew that. He crunched happily, and I wondered if he proposed to stay for some time. I had 2 telephone calls to make, and I had planned to wash my hair, but obviously a host's duties came before these things. Why is it, I wondered, surveying my guest's relaxed attitude, that people generally imagine that a single woman is dying for company? After all, a woman living alone has just as many chores to do as her married counterpart. In fact, she is probably busier, as she has to do them all herself. When I returned from the school, I still faced my household tasks, correspondence, far too much of it, and ever-present washing, ironing, and mending. Gardening, shopping, and modest entertaining have to be fitted in, and I do what I can to help in various village activities, even if it only involves minding the hat and shoe stall at the W.I. Jumble sale while the chief stallholder slips off for a tea break. I am also fair game for anyone collecting contributions to various bazaars and keep a supply of homemade jam and marmalade for instant largesse to these worthy causes. It's not that I am an unsocial person, but having spent the best part of the day with a host of demanding children, my fellow teacher, not to mention Mrs. Pringle, Mr. Willett, and various callers of an educational complexion, I am really very content to gain the blissful solitude of the schoolhouse and a few hours' peace. How is Elizabeth? I asked politely. Mrs. Maughan is an energetic member of the Fairacre community and keeps her husband up to his duties as the vicar's right hand, as well as his numerous commitments as an authority on birds. Oh, she's in Ireland, said Henry, gone to see an old aunt of hers. The poor thing has always been difficult and has gone through companion after companion since her husband Roderick died. You make her sound somewhat cannibalistic, I replied. She is, my dear, she is. Henry sat up, scattering a few fragments of mincemeat on the hearthrug. I was amused to watch him collecting them carefully on a licked finger and transferring them to his mouth. Elizabeth's gone over to see if she can persuade her into a nursing home. Fat chance of that, as far as I can see. Nothing short of dynamite will get her out of that barn of a place she lives in. Has she always lived there? Ever since she married some 60 years ago. It's one of those moldering old Victorian castles, all pepper-pot turrets and cross-draughts and the most peculiar fungi growing in the attic bedrooms. Still, it does give shelter to some rare owls and bats, and for that reason I should be sorry to see the place pulled down. Is that likely to happen? Very likely, I should think, if she can be persuaded to sell. My chief concern is that Elizabeth doesn't bring her back to stay with us. The position would be quite impossible. We really have enough to do looking after ourselves these days, and I can't think how we'd manage with dear old Aunt Thora in our midst. How old is she? 93 and good for another 10 years. He sighed heavily and put 2 logs thoughtfully on my fire. I watched in amused silence. And when do you expect Elizabeth to come back? God knows, he said morosely. The house is deathly quiet without her. It's one of the reasons I came out tonight, to see a bit of company. He rose suddenly from the chair. Nice of you to have me in like this, he said, struggling into his coat. I'll pop in again if I may. You always cheer me up, and I'm sure you're as lonely as I am. I smiled politely as I took him to the door. Bang goes my hair wash, I said to Tibby on my return. Well, we'll follow Miss Reed further into spring and eventually into summer at Fairacre next time.